Hello and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. As always, we are very proud to bring this episode to you with the support of Strength by Numbers. Strength by Numbers have created an integrated clinical and sports performance system. The AXIT system uses force plates, dynamometry and strain gauges to objectively measure everything from isolated movements to sports performance tasks. The system has greatly enhanced our clinical practice, decision making and objectivity. We are no longer guessing. The greatest thing is its ease of use for both practitioners and our clients. There are no wires, no fixed setup, it's a fully integrated Bluetooth system. If this sounds like something that would enhance your practice, visit strengthbynumbers.com and tell them that Melbourne Athletic Development sent you. So we are very lucky today to be joined by Keogh, who is an addiction psychologist primarily. He's a psychologist obviously by training, but works mostly in the area of addiction. And I thought we'd open this chat by asking the basic question, what is addiction, Marco?
So that's, I guess, addiction psychologist primarily, and for the first period of my career, definitely primarily focused on addiction, working in an addiction centre really. But
where was that?
That's at the Melbourne Clinic, and
Yep.
not too far from here in Richmond.
Yep.
On Church Street. It's a psychiatric hospital, and there's an addiction unit there which is comprised of a detox, which is people stay there for 7 to 10 days, and there's a rehab there, a 28-day rehab, and we also have a day program as well for ongoing care. So I'm there 1 day a week now. I was originally there full time, and it's gradually moved away from the practice there to developing my own practice, and where I reckon half to 60% of my clients would be in the addiction field, and
what is
range
it?
of what is it?
Yeah, what is addiction?
All right. So if you were to go by the DSM,
Let's hear the
Marco version of it. It's multifaceted, very multifaceted.
We have time.
Yeah.
What are characteristics of some of the people that you see that lead them to being classified as being addictive or having addictive behavior?
So that way you're looking at how is addiction a symptom of other issues. So you can either be looking at the characteristics that define addiction, and they're a little bit more set, but then you've got the underlying issues that lead to addiction. So addiction in itself is characterised by generally it's associated with substances that have an addictive nature, substances that develop a greater level of tolerance. The more you have them, the more you require them, and that lead to generally pretty negative consequences. And when people have generally when it's characterised by having a desire to change it, to not consume the substance, and attempted to do so and are unable to stop doing that would be one of the criteria of addiction.
Do you see people with addiction that's outside of, say, drug or alcohol use, that they have certain other addictive behaviours within?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So gambling.
Yeah, okay.
And how is that different to something that's substance based? Or is it not? How is there there's different biology, although some people would describe have a level of withdrawal from gambling, some physiological experiences that are not that dissimilar to withdrawing from other substances. I haven't seen too much of that, but in terms of what you would describe as the neurobiology of addiction, the areas of the brain that are being activated, the behaviours associated with it, the craving process, the way in which areas of what you would think of associate with wise action being shut down and being dictated by more say primitive pathways of the brain. They're very similar. Which are what? All right. Educate us.
All right. So when someone is in active addiction or experiencing a craving for addiction, more older regions of the brain are highly active.
Which one?
So basically subcortical areas of the brain, a lot of them. All right, but those that are associated with more primitive needs. So things like the need for the desire for sex, food, warmth when cold, to cool down when overheated, the need for salt if you're low in sodium, those sort of areas of the brain which are more associated with immediate survival. Addiction tends to hijack them. I actually subscribe to the notion that addiction is, I think, hijacking areas of the brain that are designed for primarily for food. Yeah. So if you're because of the dopaminergic system of reward, the movement toward foods that are particularly gratifying, particularly those that are calorically dense,
high salt, high fat,
honey. When it's reported that in hunter-gatherer tribes, when honey is found, everything stops. And gorging behaviour is normal, which makes sense adaptively, because if you're
not going to come across that very often, are you, in those societies? But now we can go down the street and buy honey.
And honey's everywhere.
Yeah,
the equivalent of honey is everywhere. But it's not problematic in a hunter-gatherer environment where it's not available very very often, and gorging on that is actually adaptive.
Yeah, it's similar for nuts too, isn't it? Because they're typically an autumnal type availability, which is actually evolutionary advantageous because of the high calorie density leading into winter.
Yes, that's right. So I would imagine, so I hadn't thought about nuts, but I think anything that's calorically dense is going to hit so one of the reward centres of the brain is I've forgotten the name of it now.
It'll come back to you.
Yeah, the nucleus accumbens, but it's far more complex than that. But that's one area that's often associated with that. So you eat a lot in a short period of time, particularly stuff that's relatively easy to get. So there's low. It's almost like it's almost like we have an algorithm within our brain. If something's low cost, high reward in terms of taste, the reason it tastes so good is because it increases the likelihood of us surviving.
Yes.
So we're going to have calories, add fat, glycogen in where we need glycogen, so as we're more likely to survive a famine and go off and get food and our resources met and get our genes into the next generation.
This makes me think of like a million, keep going, but it makes me think of so many questions to come off the back of this.
Well, I guess what we're from the original question is that high reward center of the brain and the movement toward those sorts of things. So we're designed to be exposed to those sorts of rewards in our evolutionary history, in the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. I don't think we were really designed to be exposed to substances of addiction.
Yeah.
Do you
there
think
might be some indications of where we've had certain levels of exposure to it, but
you mean like historically in say hunter-gatherer tribes using like ayahuasca and stuff.
But that's not addictive.
Okay. Yeah, but I mean those kind of substances.
We may be exposed to certain substances, mind altering for spiritual reasons.
Yeah.
But the things like booze and other things.
But it wasn't even like
that's relatively late though in terms of its discovery.
Okay. Well, what about
alcohol or ayahuasca?
Even like a lot of psychedelic types of substances. Right. But do you see food as like a core component because of the fact that, from an evolutionary standpoint, it's such a
survival.
It's just like something that's been around much longer before humans actually were around itself.
Okay. Well, I guess that's the environment that we were exposed to, where food was around before us. But obviously,
and like
the reward center is going to be geared toward. You're not going to get very far without a lot of food. And as I say, the foods that are calorically dense are going to taste really good. They're going to give us a dopamine hit, and the behaviours that led toward getting that get reinforced, or the neurological pathways that led to that, that have after there's a dopamine hit, there's some sort of process that goes by that myelinates the axons along that pathway that led to that behaviour, so it's more likely to occur again, so that you're more likely to reproduce that behaviour. It's basic conditioning.
It's interesting because, like as I said before, it makes me think of a number of questions, and one of them is that
we haven't answered the question of how substance use hijack the...
Explain that.
So we're designed, I don't know what the dopamine kind of numbers are. I mean, people have reported certain things about how much of a dopamine hit you get from certain behaviours, be it sex, be it food or whatever, but the reward you get in terms of the dopamine hit from substances is far more marked than you would get from food.
I know you mentioned this even the other day. There's an issue with the scale at which you receive that dopaminergic reaction, and then you're unable to reproduce that even with exposure to, say, that drug again. Yeah. And then you have this issue where you're always chasing.
Yeah, there's that element as well.
You're chasing that experience, which it's probably
can't be reproduced.
And what causes that to not be able to be reproduced? Is there just not the same level of dopaminergic reaction in terms of how much is secreted or something like that?
Well, is it also part of how often you have it? Is there an issue of, say, getting dopamine resistance, almost like
people have been talking about this a lot, and I've heard a few people say that's not even real, but then there's other people who say like they do like dopamine fasting.
Well, I'm about to say it would make sense, because I see that as a core issue in modern society, because it's like you go back to before talking about certain foods like honey or nuts. They're rarely available, so it's actually controlled in terms of how much you can access them and get the benefit from it, whether it be like a caloric benefit or even the like neurophysiological benefit. Whereas nowadays, we have food scientists who have figured out the perfect formula to make hyper-palatable, addictive food. Not to mention we have things like the internet with like porn or social media and all these other things.
So you've got access to finding these things easily. Yeah.
Whenever you want, 24/7.
So I think, I guess the original exposure to it, if it's something that appeals to you, because some people, for instance, they'll use ice, they'll use
methamphetamines.
Yeah, crystal methamphetamine, and it'll be like an instant addiction. It's like within moments they would describe themselves at least as being, and then others would say this is just not the drug for me. So obviously it's going to vary between people. But I would imagine, to your question about that change over time, I imagine part of it is, if there is a change over time, that first hit is just so extraordinary, so unique to them, and because as compared to the other basic garden variety rewards of food and sex and so forth, it's so more pronounced that's a pretty altering sort of space. So but then there's the increased tolerance over time with dependence. So it's going to be less rewarding. It gets to the point where it's less about just receiving the reward and more about taking away the pain of withdrawal. But plenty of people, if they've gone through some sort of process of recovery, when they are re-exposed to that stimulus, again, the reward's pretty high, so they redevelop a sensitivity to it.
Yeah, so you can get some of that sensitivity back.
That's right.
Yep.
Yeah.
You mentioned before there are people who may take a substance and become instantly addicted.
Well, that's how I don't know whether that's actually possible.
Physiologically
but
possible.
But they're describing themselves as instantly in love with the experience and are seeking it.
So,
immediately.
What's the reason for that? Like, do you think there are contextual factors there, genetic factors, a combination of both, for why you have certain people who become more addictive to certain behaviours or substances than others?
So if someone is, for instance, there's so many answers to that, but for instance, if someone's a highly anxious person, they're just naturally, maybe they're high in trait neuroticism and highly anxious in association with that, and alcohol is an anxiolytic. They have social anxiety and they drink alcohol, and all of a sudden these situations in which they feel lesser than, they're questioning everything they're going to say, they're worrying about negative judgments from others, so socially engaging, whilst there's a desire for it, it's a torturous process, and all of a sudden you have an anxiolytic, a depressant of the nervous system, which diminishes all those fears. The anxiety is lowered, all the associated thoughts and beliefs connected to that inhibit their engagement, all of a sudden that's taken away, and they can be who they want to be in that situation. That's pretty compelling. Take it in the other direction with respect to one scenario with someone who would use ice if they have, say, issues with ADD. If they have trouble focusing, all of a sudden they have some sort of a stimulant, all of a sudden they're on, they become narrowed in their focus. All that extraneous stimuli that throws them off track is no longer an issue. All of a sudden they feel calm and connected and able to get things done, be very productive. Often it's when I'm dealing with people with ADD, one of the things I'll often ask them is what's been their experience if they've used stimulants in any form, be it ice or they've utilised someone's Ritalin, which is often the case. And if before it gets out of hand, what was their experience in those early days when they just started to dabble? And often they'll describe it as I just felt normal. I felt able to focus, get things done. I wasn't as distracted. I was less impulsive. Yeah, but then the drug does what it does, and it takes over, and life becomes chaotic. But it's often a good indication. So there are two indications of, I guess, of why would someone become if they're not immediately addicted, but immediately in love with a substance. Yeah, the movement toward addiction, or I don't know if we're allowed to use the word. We're meant to use it. I think that's almost being discouraged, use of addiction. It's a severity of substance use disorder, I think is the...
Is that the term, is it?
I think it's, I presume there's a sort of a stigmatic element to the use of the word addict.
Yeah, well, there might be, but I think...
I'm not worried about it.
Yeah, it's the kind of behaviour. So.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this in preparation for this discussion about this mismatch, and I think it's become this. I'll explain.
Okay.
This mismatch that seems to be coming up everywhere when you hear psychologists, biologists speak about evolution, and how a lot of our behaviours don't seem to match up, and this being the mismatch between what we evolved to need for our survival, reproduction, and thriving in that environment of evolution and time,
the environment,
to the modern
environment. Yeah.
And the modern times where we now have a very different environment, which we don't seem to necessarily always have the best adapted traits to survive in that environment. In fact, those things seem to almost be killing some of us, whether that's in the short term or the long term. And this kind of stuff you're describing about addiction seems to be a bit of this almost evolutionary mismatch. Do you see it like that, or do you see it differently?
Explain a bit more about how you see you're perhaps seeing addiction as an example of that mismatch.
Well,
for instance, basically what we were saying before, we're designed to move toward reward.
Yes.
High dopamine hits are usually associated with survival.
Yeah, whereas with this, if someone becomes addicted to food or to gambling or to anything that will evoke this kind of dopaminergic action, and they're pressing the dopamine button over and over and over, it's obviously not very productive for their long-term
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right.
And survival.
There are so many things. There is just, what's that book, Dopamine Nation? I can't remember the name of the author. I heard her talking to Huberman. She just talks about just how our culture now is just, the availability of things that stimulate the dopaminergic system are just ubiquitous.
Yes.
There's so much of them.
In that theory...
This is not what we're meant to be exposed... We're just not meant to be exposed to that much.
Well, I was going to say, do you think in that theory, John, that it's also related to our physical environment? Because of the fact that we're not spending time in like a natural environment, outdoors, and even like from a standpoint of... I think about how much time we digest information now too, whether it's listening to podcasts or having conversations. Doesn't matter what it is, Yeah, because like most of the time you'd be just sort of sitting around doing very little. From an evolutionary standpoint.
Well, I often think about that. I think about what did people before they had phones and TVs and...
They were bored.
Well, sure I think
I heard someone talking about this before, they were bored, and that was a good thing because it made them think of stuff and come up with ideas and actually be creative or do things, that filled in time in a productive sense. But now boredom is not a thing.
Yeah. When I look at animals, I look at like a cat just sitting there, and I'm just thinking, what is that? What is your subjective experience of that?
Isn't the cat plotting your murder? Isn't that what they say, that most people's cats are plotting how they can kill their owner and eat them?
So take away the sociopathy of a cat, but just an animal that's just sitting there, it's able to just sit there in its own skin. I'm wondering, are you just really deadly bored there, or you're in some sort of a blissful state of just being?
Ignorance is bliss, perhaps. Yeah. Well, even like the other thing too I think of is, from an evolutionary sense, you would have spent so much time looking up at, say, the night sky, and I would have thought, and
that's good TV. That would have been good TV.
And I think also too of like thinking about, well, one, what the hell is that?
Yeah.
But also, the expansive nature of the sky and thinking about
does that ever end?
Insignificance of you as an individual.
Yeah. The night thing, we're sort of doing tangential stuff now, so is that all right? Yeah. Well,
we'll come back to it. I've got lots of questions for you.
The night stuff I think is really interesting with respect to most addictive behaviours. I'm not so sure about gambling, but definitely the consuming behaviours where something is taken into the body, be it an addictive substance or problematic eating, it tends to happen more in the evening.
Okay.
So much more in the evening. Now I reckon what I've sort of concluded around that is during the day we're more task focused. We're more in that kind of that motivational mind, sort of motivational system to go out and get things done, to get our resources met, to achieve, to be more task focused. I think our mindset is more associated with that. I think it just makes sense that we would be designed to get things done when the sun's up. And the evening is more associated with licking our wounds, connecting with loved ones, engaging in maybe spiritual type practices. I presume sexual behaviour more during the evening, but perhaps not. This isn't more of a hunter-gatherer, more ancient environment. But it's more about connection in the evening, whereas the day is more task-focused. Maybe task-focused with groups, with respect to hunting, but more about connection. And I work on, part of the way in which I work with respect to addiction and most issues is from an attachment perspective. I think people that, aside from all those other biological factors that make us universally vulnerable to developing an addiction, I think a large part of people's vulnerability to addiction is an insecure attachment style. So when that is not available to people, either by virtue of poor relationships or their attachment style results in difficulties in connecting with others and being gratified through what we're designed to do, which is to interact and connect with others, be it with individuals or with a group, when that's lacking, there is a greater vulnerability to moving toward other things to regulate our emotions and to fulfill and to reduce the anxiety or the distress that comes from that lack of attachment.
I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
The only thing
so it happens more in the evening.
Well,
when we're meant to sort of vegetate and connect and engage.
As in a similar kind of thought, like I don't know, Jack might be similar. I always straight away think to physiology of the matter, and to me the reason that potentially
you move away from the emotion.
Maybe, but I think that the reason is that your emotions are heightened in the evening potentially because of fatigue. And to me, straight away, as soon as you add fatigue or hunger or any of those needs into it, we seem to drop our veil of emotional control. I think all of us will admit that when we're tired, we're emotionally a lot more volatile than when, say, we wake in the morning and been awake for an hour or two and you're kind of at your brightest. In terms of, there's lots of obviously research about this and biorhythms.
Because of things like the prefrontal cortex just not being on.
Well, you would understand this much more from the neuroscience point of view, but just the fact is, I know that for me, if I've been tired because I've been doing things all day, been at work or whatever, at 9 o'clock at night, it's not that hard for me to decide, I wouldn't mind some chocolate now, as opposed to 10 o'clock in the morning when I'm not tired and I haven't had enough of the day. So I do agree that there's that almost like ritualistic kind of, okay, I'm at the end of the day, it's time to, and I do think that that's very real, what you're saying.
The two would interact, wouldn't they?
Yes, there'd be that interaction. But I think...
if you combine the fact that if you're fatigued and perhaps a bit more disinhibited and more easily emotionally dysregulated as a consequence of that fatigue, plus someone who has attachment issues, either attachment insecurities or just a lack of, for whatever reasons, attachment to people, the two are going to combine, and you of course you're going to start getting attached to other things that provide a really. So that's the thing. The substances of addiction and food have a powerful emotionally regulatory effect in a way that's more predictable than relationships. Yeah. You know, even good relationships in fact, good relationships should be challenging. So there's going to be conflict and the need to resolve conflict if you have an insecure attachment, and particularly an anxious, preoccupied sort of attachment style where you're more dependent on others validating you, that's challenging. It's difficult to move toward. It can be quite triggering. A bottle of alcohol is, you know what you're going to get from that. It's whilst in the end it does damage to those very things that make you vulnerable to it in the first place. In the moment, it's predictable. It's a depressant of the nervous system. It's going to take away temporarily your anxieties and your fears. You get it back with interest the next day. But in that moment, when those very primitive needs are being activated, you're moving towards something to get immediate gratification and comfort. Because it's activating a really primitive fear, like the fear of abandonment, the fear of being ostracized from the tribe. That's death. That's the equivalent. It
may as well
of
be death, emotionally.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and you hear of people dying in those situations well before they would actually starve or dehydrate. They just die by virtue of not being a part of the group anymore.
It makes me think, okay, for people who, for instance, and I don't know, you can explain this if it fits within the bounds of what you're saying with the attachment styles and preoccupations, but for people who do have the ability to say no to things like that, even in
to say no to things like
addictive food,
right,
and have self-control in those situations.
Yep.
Do you think that that's tied in with that, attachment and the comfort with, their attachment kind of, I don't know how to
Are you asking me, so if someone has a more secure...
Yes, that's the word I'm looking for that I can't find.
So a secure attachment style is where someone has a strong sense of self.
Yes.
Not an egotistical, narcissistic, but just a strong sense of self, but a greater willingness to develop intimacy and trust in others. They're not naive in that trust of others, though they're more able to deal with, say, ruptures in a relationship because they're not overly dependent on that connection. They've usually a secure attachment is associated with a history where ruptures can be moved through, and you discover relationships don't have to be perfect all the time. In fact, that rupture and I guess the dialogue that would go with that leads to an enhancement of the relationship. Yeah. So there's this, secure attachment is associated with a strong sense of self and a willingness to develop intimacy with others.
Would you say that people who tend to fit into that sort of category
far less vulnerable to substance?
Yes.
Far less.
Okay. That's the thought that I had straight away.
Yeah, because so whereas a person with, we'll say with the insecure, the anxious attachment style, a rupture in a relationship feels really dangerous. Yeah, so it's usually associated with inconsistent levels of availability of parental figures. Hard to trust when they're going to be there, what's going to result in a sense of connection, what's going to result in punishment. So what tends to happen as a consequence of that is a lowered sense of self and a greater emphasis on the other, monitoring the other, making sure they're not going to get rejected, a really reactive response to the negative emotions associated with rejection, real or imagined. So very emotionally dysregulated by their environment, far more vulnerable to it. So everyone feels distress and emotional pain from what's going on around them, but a person with that type of attachment style is generally, it's far more
taxing on them when something like that happens.
That's right. It's up and down. So hence the greater tendency to move toward something that's a little bit more reliable.
Yes.
But then that does damage to them, does damage to their relationship, so that ends up exacerbating the attachment insecurity as well. So it becomes this horrible vicious cycle.
In the circumstance where, let's say someone has a lot of positive components to their life, like for instance they've got good relationships, they have a good diet, they sleep well, they're physically active. Let's say there's a lot of positive components associated with their health, both physically and psychologically. Can you harness... Are there things that you can do to harness traits of addiction to benefit you? Like I'm thinking of this even from like pursuing a career and like the requirements of the work associated with that, or even like athletic performance I think of too. Because would it be fair to say, certain athletes must have pretty addictive types of personality traits in order for them to be able to stick to that particular task.
The two things, and I'm sure there'd be a whole array of responses to that, but the two things that come to mind immediately for me are people who are just naturally high on the trait of conscientiousness, which can involve a certain level of obsessionality.
And why is that? What is it about conscientious people that leads to that type of behaviour?
It would just make sense if you're more. I don't know exactly why it leads to it from a biological, neurological perspective.
Remind me, what are the substructures of conscientiousness? One's industrious. There's another one, isn't there?
There's the focus on neatness.
Yeah, that's right.
Order.
Yes, order.
Overly focus on cleanliness and. So this is perhaps a little less I guess they could be both as well. If you're high in obsessionality, that is pretty associated with addictive type behaviour as well. Things have to be a particular way. You're anxious if they don't go precisely.
Quite controlling, really.
Yeah, you're inflexible. Your worth as a person is overly dependent on making sure that you're trained so many times a week. If you miss a session, there's a strong sense of guilt that comes with that.
Are they the kind of people that wouldn't do well with injuries then too, I imagine, because it's out of their control?
Yeah, no doubt. I can relate to that one.
We might come back to that because I want to explore that more. And
there was something else. What was the other thing I was going to say with that? So there's the obsessionality. I can't remember the other thing I was
Anyway, we'll come back to that because I think that's a really interesting area that will tie back.
It was one of the attachment styles.
Okay.
So the attachment style of dismissiveness, which we can come back to, which I think is in part an answer to that question as well.
I just wanted to ask you, because you mentioned it with these attachment styles, so is that something that you work on with people to drive maybe what's behind their addictive kind of behaviour? Do you start to break down some of those attachments and maybe previous, effects from whatever it is in their upbringing, whatever it is? Are the things that you're trying to we'll understand and work on?
Yeah, so we'll try to understand what's the developmental history that would contribute to that particular attachment style, to develop an understanding of how that leads to, because those early relationships, those very important relationships of family and in particular parents, the dynamics that play out there, the belief systems that you develop about yourself and others in association with that, your relationship with emotions and beliefs in association with those connections, then transfer into how you engage as an adult. So to have an understanding of those patterns and what those beliefs are, how reactive you are to certain emotional states, how that influences the way you engage and connect with others is vitally important. So to develop some insight around that can be very helpful.
Okay.
Help you to identify when it's playing out, to understand why it's playing out, to have more compassion for yourself as it's playing out. And the issue and the overall therapeutic approach is less about getting rid of those attachment styles and more about learning to work with them more effectively, to recognise when you're
trying to enhance towards that secure, because that thinks of what Jack was saying is like, is there an opportunity where if you're enhancing some of that security in your attachment that you can then start to explore and navigate, say, performance or career and see it as, this is safe for me to explore a bit, and this is safe for me to, as you said, in whether it's a work relationship, a sporting relationship or whatever, see that, as you said, you'll have conflict, but that is secure, and that's helpful.
Well, so it's unlikely for someone who has an insecure attachment style to leap into a secure attachment style.
Can you shift towards it?
I think you can approximate it.
Yes, okay.
And in certain contexts with the right people, with a psychologically minded partner who is able to understand this process and can make room for it, there's a greater possibility of developing something that resembles more of a secure attachment style and a greater ability to deal with the ruptures that occur as a consequence in association with that attachment and security. And as I was saying before, the repair of that rupture which has arisen in part because of that attachment and security, that actually helps to help you move toward a more secure attachment style.
All right, and then the question that follows up to that before we get back onto more of the performance side of it maybe.
Sure.
Is how do you think these kind of attachment styles, I don't know whether you thought about this, changes people's experience of pain? Because we see a lot of people, and I'm going to use a term that people will probably hate, but they almost become victims of their injury, pain presentation circumstance, where they almost attach to that, and then it's a perpetual issue, I guess, for us as say in the more musculoskeletal side to try and understand why someone seems to be having this experience of pain. But as soon as you started talking about these attachment styles, it made me think of certain patients who they're almost addicted to having something wrong with them. They don't want to give that up.
Okay.
They want to hold on to it, and it's almost like that's safe because
the
they
sick
know.
role.
Yes, in that essence. Do you think that in any way could be related to something like someone's security within their attachment style?
You have to think.
Yeah, I'm posing a question.
Yeah, I haven't
it,
looked at the literature on it, and I guess I can only just think of it anecdotally with people, but you have to think. One, there's, I guess, a greater, if someone's overly focused on their sporting, say, achievements for their sense of worth as a person, injuries, and there's an obsessionality around that, an inflexibility around that. An injury is going to pose a far greater threat. If their sense of self is dependent on their achievements, injuries are pretty dangerous. Yeah, what do you do if this is taken away from me? Who am I? You know, if you haven't learned to actually,
I almost see it sometimes.
It's probably not the people you were thinking of. You're thinking of more the histrionic sort of response.
You sometimes see, like, I'll give an example. You do see it in athletes sometimes where there is the athlete who, when they get injured, they will describe everything in reference to their injury, as if they had no control over any of that, and they almost became the victim of their injury, right? That one you see a bit, and they're the people who I think they've almost swapped what you're saying, like their perception of who they are as a person is built on the fact that they're this athlete, and then when they can't be that, they attach to, well, I was injured and this injury caused all of these issues.
Yeah.
And you ask them how they're going, and the first thing they say is they ask you about injuries. It's like they've defined themselves by this injury. Like, there's an athlete who obviously I won't mention, but one of the things that they say to even the athletes I coach, one of the first things they say is, how's your body?
Oh, I did that today when I came in here.
And that drives me absolutely bananas.
I'm here also originally as a patient. Right? Yeah. And I came in today, and Jack and I have been, of late working on a calf injury. And he asked, I think one of the first things I said is I've exacerbated my calf injury. So I'm telling him that, and Jack's pretty good in sort of, okay, all right, we're not going to get injured. Let's get straight on to how we work with it. You didn't even turn around. I don't even know if you even heard it.
No, I did.
But
I don't engage with it because I hate that kind of behaviour.
Exactly. So that, but I was reacting to that as well.
Yeah.
I was thinking, why isn't he even acknowledging the fact that I've hurt my calf? So there's an element. I'd say what you're seeing in your patients, your athletes, or whatever, is something that I definitely experience.
Yeah,
and injuries for me are just so associated with a lack of achievement, a lack of potentialising what I
out of interest, John,
identify.
Who is the athlete?
No, for this person.
Is
this someone? Do they only ask these questions when they're in this environment? Because I also think
they ask it almost every time they see some of my athletes.
Because I also just think, for you obviously associate.
It's a contextual thing,
with a particular for a particular reason.
But you see it a lot. Say, for instance, obviously I'm at the track, and there'll be people that you see at the track, and the first thing that you say to them is, "How are you going?"
Yeah.
To me, I don't give a stuff even how they're running. They could be breaking the world record. I'm actually asking, how are you?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They'll talk about their performance, they'll talk about injuries, they'll talk about all sorts of things. And sometimes it's to pump themselves up, sometimes it's, it's an excuse about why they didn't do something. And I'm like, I actually don't care about that. Like, I want to know how you are going as a person. And I find it really interesting because to me, that's almost that insecurity that they attach to something to kind of...
I think you also, if we want to look at I think you probably moved more toward a dismissive attachment style as well. So you're going to if that is the case, you're going to be more inclined to dismiss emotional vulnerability.
Well, no, if someone's actually, it's funny because, some people think I'm not particularly empathetic, but most of the time it's because I would say that I'm very aware of bullshit, where people want sympathy when there's nothing wrong with them and they have the skills to be able to navigate whatever problem they've got.
Yeah.
So I won't offer any help at that point.
Yeah.
But if anyone who knows me well has ever actually needed help, they'll know that I'm one of the first people that will give up all the time I've got. If I sense that there's actually something's wrong and they need help, I will help them. But if they're just being a sook, which most of the time, most people just want a pat on the back, right? And say, you're going okay, then I will let them navigate themselves because I actually trust that they have the skills to navigate that.
So one of the issues that plays out a lot in my practice, or can play out a lot, is people get into that sick role, and there can be a real, and sometimes I'll pose this question to them: what would it be like for you to be genuinely thriving and not to need me, not to need this therapeutic context? And that'd be scary for some people. For some people, because that's their way of being loved, of being cared for,
and identify so strongly with it.
Well, it's the danger of becoming a fully fledged adult who stands on their own 2 feet. You don't have to have any element of a parent-child dynamic there. You're responsible for yourself. That's quite threatening. It's not easy to be a fully fledged adult.
Well, going back to your point, John, I think you and I are actually quite similar in that sense, and it's something that I think people confuse of at least how I see something like compassion, because I think it's quite a low resolution reaction to say when someone...
True compassion is, I think it's very different, but there's a big difference between true compassion and sympathy. And people, they actually think that they're the same thing, and they're not. Showing someone sympathy is not helpful to them in any way.
It's actually quite a low resolution.
Exactly.
Sort of
true compassion would be going, okay, well, I'm going to help you because you need the help.
Totally.
This is how we're going to address this. And part of that may be a sympathetic word or whatever, but it's real. It's not just, pat, you'll be okay, I'm going the other way because I don't want to know about your problem.
Totally. And it's obviously relevant to the particular situation. Like, if someone's just lost a loved one unexpectedly, you're obviously going to be like, okay, I understand there's going to be a grievance period and I'm here just even as physical presence for you. But then there needs to be a point of like, well, what do you need to do to get better? And can I help you in any way? But more importantly, the responsibility needs to be put on that individual.
There's a delicate, there's a dance.
Well, it's like your own role, and John and I look very similar. As like, I see myself as someone who can assist people through their rehabilitation process. Very rarely am I going to be the person that cures them, so to speak. Maybe there are some circumstances where someone's got a right neck and you do some manual therapy, and like, that feels a lot better.
You're teaching them to fish.
You give them tools. So, like, as I said, I find that interesting because you see that kind of presentation a bit. If we go away from that athletic one, as you said, it's that sick role, and we see it a lot. The one that I see it in a lot, and we don't do much of it, and it's on purpose, is, say, compensable patients, work cover, TAC, where they feel so slighted by the incident or the accumulation of insult from their job.
Or where it encourages a level of malingering.
Yes, and they actually attach to the pain that they have, they attach to the injury, and they want to malinger because there is benefit to it. I had a
client who was on a pretty healthy, what's it called, when you're income insurance sort of package, and he was on corporate job, big pay, and was getting like 80% of his pay. And he was even able to say to me, and he was experiencing genuine depression. All the symptoms of a profound depression, and he could even say to me, I'm worried that what's happening here is that the sick role is being encouraged by this situation where I'm actually being looked after financially by staying sick. I actually don't feel and don't even want to go back into that corporate role. It's not healthy for me, but it's actually in my best interest in a way, financially, in the situation, to remain in this. There are too many factors contributing to it. To that, and he was even aware of it and didn't like that.
And that shows good insight, doesn't it?
That's right. But how compelling it is for someone who's even aware of it.
Well, I think that's the interesting thing because, as we said before about this kind of modern society and where we are, almost everything is forcing us towards being fat and lazy, right? Because we can be if we want to be. what I think is more unique now, and it's difficult when you have these conversations with people, we have it obviously in a rehabilitation sense. They go, well, why can't you just fix me? And it's like, well, you've taken X amount of time to develop all of these deficiencies to get to this point for something to break down.
Yeah.
You need to build them back up in order to be able to navigate whatever sort of problem you've got or skill set you need to be able to carry out or biomechanical kind of experience. You know, it's really interesting because we've gotten so used to being able to receive things and get the reward really quickly that when that reward isn't forthcoming, people struggle with it.
Well, I was just going to say, because to that point too, I often think one of the biggest correlates for determining the success of patients we work with is their willingness for change, like behavioural change.
But it has to be gradual.
Yes,
it feels like you're just so quickly saying, grow up.
Not at all.
Rather than recognising it has to be a slight, bit by bit movement toward maturation.
Like I wouldn't say, like it probably sounds like that, and I'm not trying to make it sound like that, and that makes it sound very black and white. Like Jack and I actually, even just in the last few weeks, we talked about this concept of, running what we call safe to fail experiments, where it fits almost into this Vygotsky kind of zone of proximal development, and you're just creeping them a little bit forward.
A little bit of chaos.
Yeah, can you try this today? And if you achieve and tick that box off, maybe we can go to here. I know it sounds like I'm just like, oh, get on it. You should just be able to go from here to here.
Throw them out of the nest.
That's not necessarily the case. The thing that I think, the point that Jack made that I really agree with is they need to be willing to even just take that little step.
If they're not, and you have to reward that.
Yeah.
So if someone's say is buying too heavily into the sick role, and maybe that's the way in which they were kind of given some level of comfort, they were identified with that from a very young age. To just, when there's a slight movement away from that to some level of individuation and maturity, to really encourage that. But to recognise it's going to take time. As you say, it took a long time to get to this point. You're not going to be able to turn it around.
Is that something that are you doing similar things when you're trying to navigate a psychological puzzle? Might be an addiction puzzle, but you're trying to slowly shift them towards behaviours that aren't detrimental to them? That's
right. Yeah, it's about progress, not perfection, which is a line that's used a lot in the 12-step sort of community. They've got some good lines in there, some good little maxims.
Well, the things that the mantras that you can kind of keep repeating.
Well, I see it as a cultural revolution, a cultural evolution. There, the things that have had some effect over time get kept. They get refined down over time to be effective. Yeah.
I always have that argument with people about different things, but things that survive and continue to be used obviously have some utility.
Hence the value of tradition. Don't throw away traditions just willy-nilly.
Yeah, and
they're there for a really
that's another
reason.
Debate, I guess. But I do think that there's an interesting role to play with how you kind of navigate that person going forward. If we go back to the point that Jack, because I'm really interested in this, now that we've got you here to talk, if for instance, as Jack mentioned before, you want to harness some of these things. Now obviously in someone who's really struggling with whether it's obsessive behaviours or traits, addiction, maybe you're not necessarily going to be in a position to shift them whole scale to I'm improving their life, their performance, outcomes, whatever. Can you reprogram some of the things that you're doing from a psychological intervention perspective to do that stuff? Is it as simple as, and I'm speaking completely off the cuff here, so correct me when I say something stupid. You take those little steps that we spoke about there of like, find out what they're maybe motivated by, find out what they want to do and take them in those little psychological steps of, okay, this behavior is really valuable for you in the long run. And I see it's, maybe it's something simple like preparing your meals if you're an athlete.
Yes.
Right? Today we're just going to, we're going to teach you how to make one meal.
Yes.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
Do you think you can do that once a week?
Yes.
And is that...
You're sounding very, what's his name at the moment?
What's that?
Very Peterson-like.
Oh, yeah. Clean your room.
That's right, yeah. Can you just get out of bed? Can you sit up?
Yeah. But I mean, are there ways of, reprogramming your own brain almost to be able to navigate to a point where you actually are extending
your progress?
So
one of the things that one of the areas that I also work in primarily when I'm at the clinic is group work.
Yep.
Okay.
And when you mean group, you mean like multiple people at the same time?
So the ideal number is about 8 plus or minus 2, but it can vary to be a few less than that.
I feel like that would be a very interesting experience.
Well, the group it's called interpersonal process group therapy, and it's not a didactic group. We're not. There are no themes. The function of the group is to work on relationship issues. So it sounds like hell.
No, I'm laughing because Jack's bloody moving his feet around again.
Okay.
And I was about to yell at him.
Oh, I see. So based on what I was saying before about the significance of attachment for people's psychology and their well-being and their vulnerability to addiction when that's lacking, there's a greater vulnerability to addiction. So group therapy is focused on people learning to enhance their relationships with others, to find out what their issues are
do you
with
have
others.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you have to evolve to be able to get into group therapy, or is it something?
No, you just have to be a human being. There are certain conditions which would
you wouldn't let certain people
so
in.
If someone's in a
we'll let you in, John.
If someone's psychotic, that's a
no-no.
delimiting criteria. If someone's substance affected at that time,
yes,
things of that nature.
But so it's not a graduation of like, okay, you've done enough work that you're now ready to go to groups. You can just go along because
we tend to sort of giving away some secrets here. We tend to observe people if they're going into the clinic for detox or rehab to see how they function within a group setting and whether they would be really suited to it. I think most people can get something out of it though. Some people it's perhaps not. It may be counter-therapeutic. They're just not up for that type of interaction. The type of feedback they get would be too distressing and would actually put a bad taste in their mouth therapeutically, and might be more suited to more didactic groups which are more skills-based.
Yeah, you're sort of running them through different
things like DBT and acceptance and commitment therapy and things like that, which are a little bit more focused on skills, might be a better example of that. Yeah, but so in that group therapy context where people are basically where you just engage, you talk about your issues, but the function of the therapist is to bring it back to how they're relating to each other within the group, including the therapist. And the reason for that is their issues that they have interpersonally. Their personality, their ways of communicating, their attachment styles, all things that are of interpersonal significance are going to play out in that group, which gives such an insight into how you actually engage out there. They might say all sorts of things about themselves in terms of who they are as a person. It may not necessarily reflect what really goes on out in the real world. You bring that into the group where there's natural interaction. The truth tends to come out in that sort of situation, and there's an opportunity for greater insight into those sorts of issues, and to work on communicating and engaging and connecting and developing healthier attachments within that group, and how to deal with addictive type challenges in association with relationship issues.
Is that confronting for you, having to share your interpersonal stuff?
Not anymore. I guess sometimes it will be. Yeah, I mean, there was a group that played out on Friday, and as a consequence of that, and there's something I've been trying to work on for a while, which I struggle with, and you may even say it's been happening here today. I'll tell me if I'm on. So no, because it's very spontaneous, and I work better with that. Hate's probably too strong. I've gotten better. I hate having to teach a class when there's a set amount of things. I'd rather just put a few things on the board and just see where it goes.
Well, that's what these talks are about. We put a few things on the board and then we see where they go.
Yeah, whereas some therapists who are far more structured, they like it to be like a class, like a school, and they have a certain amount of things that they have to get through, and if they don't, they get a bit anxious about that. Whereas I find that really painful. Yeah. The group therapy setting, you don't know where it's going. You have no idea where it's going.
But that feels really part, isn't it?
And it feels really alive. And once you've done that enough, you trust that. And the unpredictable things, because I'm very invested, my ego, my self-concept is associated with being a very good group therapist. So any anxieties I have about group not being predictable overridden by my identification with being a good therapist. So a group that goes well, it stokes my ego and feels really good, which relates to the thing that I'm trying to work on at the moment, where I am a little disinhibited in group in the sense that I can interrupt people and I can lack patience in allowing things to, because if I think there's an opportunity for me to say something really clever or really therapeutically effective in that moment, particularly in a way that's going to reflect well on me, I find it hard to not do that, when if I was to tap into my wisdom, I think this really needs to play out for much longer. They need to work this out for themselves. A good therapist, a good group therapist is often perceived by the group as not having that much of an effect, whereas the therapists that are perceived as amazing, their groups are often less effective. Which is you have to be able to sit on your hands and park your ego at the door a bit, but I struggle with that.
I think that phenomenon though can be translated to other health professions, even our own, because the reality is, it goes back to like the idea that we talked about before of, you really want to give people the tools to be able to look after themselves. Like, you make yourself essentially more redundant in the process.
Yeah, that's the ideal, isn't
it's
it?
Interesting though too, because that from a marketing standpoint is not a good way to sell yourself or a product, is it?
I think ultimately, if you were to be really sort of logical, business-wise, marketing-wise, if you're more effective with people, overall it's going to lead to better outcomes, and probably you're more marketable rather than instantly seem amazing.
Yeah. Part of it probably is in terms of the actual amount of conversational buzz associated with you or a particular product, as opposed to the actual outcomes.
So on last Friday, and I said, I've been conscious of being a bit disinhibited. So there's something playing out in the group, and I've got this idea so that they're a bit off track, and there's something far more important to be discussed. I've interrupted people and tried to bring it back to the thing that I discern as far more important. So that's something that I'm struggling to curtail, and my intent is to actually bring the group into that process for me, and to talk about this is an issue for me, and if you notice it playing out, to let me know.
It's interesting that, because I think that I notice that a lot with coaching. Like, you want to interject, but you have to learn to not, and you have to. One of the things that it's become, I actually was lucky enough, I've mentioned him before, but the BIS physiologist, Vish, has become a really good resource for me. And we caught up the other day and we're talking, and I was saying to him, like, the more time goes on, the more I need to trust my athletes to be able to navigate processes, and I might create what I think are maybe safe boundary conditions, but not necessarily put myself in there to direct it too much.
Yeah.
And it makes me think a lot of what you're saying of, you have this want to jump in all the time, but that's not helpful. And
to matter, the need to matter.
But also, I think the point here too is, just because you don't think it's important doesn't mean that they don't. And the reality is, if they see it as being significant, and you're dismissive of that, it's a good way to lose their trust and respect pretty quickly.
But also, I think we spoke about this even maybe in the discussion last week or week before, just about interjecting too much in someone carrying out, say, a skill. And I remember I was talking with one of the students that we have here, one of the physio students, and they mentioned they're like, we'll be in the rehab space, and they say, oh, you don't actually give too many instructions to people. And I said, yeah, because I want to see what they do with the limited instructions that I give them. And if I need to change it, I will, if they're going way off on a tangent.
There's excessive risk. And
and it's sort of like outside the bandwidth, but you have to let them explore it, because I'm not the one carrying out the skill, they are. And I think that that's one of the things that we get caught up, like, last week we spoke with Associate Professor Tanya Pizzari, and she's talking about motor control. And I know afterwards Jack and I were talking about this, of one of the concerns that we have with the current concept of motor control in our profession, or even in all physical therapies, is it's overly directed. It's not an exploration of movement with some, as I said, boundary conditions. It's do exactly as I say in the pattern that I say, and that's going to make you have less pain and fix your knee, shoulder, hip, whatever. And to us, that doesn't fit inside the model of understanding human behavior, which is in nature complex behavior.
And seeing emergent patterns, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the greatest phenomena of all sort of biological systems and all of those kind of things, is that great things seem to come from unexpected places. And when you were talking about letting them kind of go off on their tangents and talk about things, makes me think that there's probably opportunities there that they'll actually navigate, whether it's their own problem by hearing someone else say something and come to you with insights, and you go, I didn't even intuit that from what they said, but you did, which is awesome, because we're actually getting to the crux of what's driving maybe some of your addictive behaviours.
And my job is more to stoke that, to cultivate that, to say just a few things where appropriate to enable that to evolve and develop, to give them that opportunity, rather than, I guess, it's probably too strong a word, but infantilizing them by coming in and offering my wisdom as often as I can.
As a practitioner, what are the things that you're doing to try and navigate that yourself? Because you mentioned you sometimes have problems with it. I definitely do, and even I'm sure it's obvious in this conversation, like I jump in because I enjoy jumping in.
Well, what I'm doing right now by disclosing this to you on a fucking camera, for God's sake, and I'm doing that with others, with clinicians, being open to feedback from a trusted clinician the other day who made reference to this, and I was saying to her, yeah, absolutely right, and it is something I'm trying to work on, being more open to that. It kind of consolidates it, because if I just do it quietly by myself, I can sort of pat myself on the back for trying to do it, but I'm not really doing it. It makes me a bit more accountable. I think trying to be mindful of the urge, the impulse to move in that sort of direction, to recognise what is it serving, what am I looking for in that? What is that about for me? I think it's largely to do with needing that gratification for being perceived as ineffective.
Here's a question for you,
and being willing to tolerate the discomfort of not moving toward that.
Well, that's part of the question.
And
that
to
I
tap
have
into a higher reward for a job actually more effectively done, which is more going to be measured by me than probably by others. Because others aren't really going to see much of that, because it's too subtle. Yeah, it's down the track.
Well, as I said, like, that makes me think very strongly about that idea of how do you actually recreate that, and what do you do when you, in a non-egoistic way, actually believe that the input you've got is going to be valuable, and sometimes that happens in an environment where, for instance, the people don't have the information that you potentially have, whether it's through your training or experience or whatever, that you do think actually intervening now at this point is a valuable input. How do you navigate that? Or, because you don't want it to end up in a position where it's just like, I'm not letting them jump off, into this ridiculous tangent, but I'm not going to over constrain it either. Is that just something that at an individual level you kind of have to navigate and work out, or is it, it's always egoistic because you're jumping in?
You said a lot there. I haven't completely clarified the question. Can you try to sort of say it again in another way?
Basically,
more
like
condensed form.
Well, I'll give you an example, right? Because straight away I think to coaching, right? I've got a number of athletes who I don't know that they verbalize things that well.
Yes.
But from a performance perspective, and from, Jack uses this term I love, which is interoception, which is their ability to kind of perceive internally what's going on. They're brilliant. Yeah. Right? But how they verbalize that is not always that sophisticated. And me thinking I'm smarter than everyone in that setting wants to jump in and say, no, you're experiencing this or you're experiencing that.
Because you can find the words to, and that's empowering. Yeah.
Is there value in leaving that alone and letting that kind of play out to see how far they can take it? Or are you setting them up to destroy themselves in some way
So I'm just thinking
I think
of the
other part of your question though here, John, is thinking as you as the coach or, like therapist or whatever it is, what are the psychological traits that you have that may actually get in the way of the development or progress of the individual that you're working with too?
Well, I think that happens a lot in the healthcare setting.
Totally.
Particularly, it's probably a little bit different obviously in your profession because speaking and having environments to allow people to explore ideas is normal. You go to one really big extreme, and we've had a number of surgeons on, and as soon as they get asked the question, they've got the answer, and that's the answer. It's really been...
It's absolute.
It's almost absolute. Not quite. And it seems like the more open surgeons are the ones, and we've had a couple on recently, people like David Delaharp, where he'll say, like, I don't think this is the right, intervention for you. Go and do X. Which to us, we think, we really attach to that because he's clearly not thinking about himself. He's clearly not thinking about his bank balance when he's making those kind of decisions. Because if he was, he would just do the surgery, right? And he's allowing himself to forego that gratification of saying, like, I'm the expert, I can do this. And it's a bit different, obviously, in these kind of settings that we're talking about compared to someone whether they need surgery or don't need surgery. Sure. But just exploring some of that with...
Hold on. Just to go back to try to find the correlation between what you were saying with respect to that situation where there's an athlete who has strong interoception, sort of intuitive understanding of their body, and will find a way to utilise that very effectively, whereas you have...
And also how they communicate that.
But a poor capacity to communicate that verbally, for whatever reason. You have a strong capacity to explain what's going on and conceptualise it and present it verbally. But that if you impose that on them, it might actually interfere with their process.
Yes, exactly.
So I'm trying to think of an equivalent for myself. So a patient, for instance, who isn't necessarily very good at verbalising, but can connect to their body and their emotions and can demonstrate those emotions in a way that's very, very effective and results in a healthier way of dealing with those emotions or connecting with another, as compared to, say, a client who might use their words to guard and protect against those vulnerable emotions. I'm just trying to think of how that might sort of... I could very easily perhaps do what you have done and apply too much of a conceptual understanding of that rather than allow that to play out at the more emotional realm.
I think because the reason I guess I probably asked this is probably the motivation for it, which might help you, is I feel like with any complex behaviour, the easiest and not necessarily the easiest, but it seems like the way in which people learn is by making mistakes and errors that correct that behaviour back towards.
Yeah, sure.
How do you, as the person who probably has more insight into what the potential outcomes are, not that you're predictive, but you're sort of saying, like, say for you, for instance, and I'm making up this example, but you have someone and they're talking about these ideas, and you're thinking, okay, to me, the way they're talking about this may actually lead to more addictive behaviours. But the fact that they're opening up about it more and they're talking about it is a really good sign. Do I allow them to keep exploring that, knowing that they may have a couple of episodes of increased addiction use?
Yeah.
Even though I could step in, give them a couple of tools that might stop those episodes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's certainly something.
And you're not doing it for you. You're actually doing it because you're like, I don't want to see them have 2 or 3 bouts of this addictive behaviour that's not good for their
which can entail risk.
But you actually see that long term, if you don't let them navigate that and explore that in an open way with the way that they're talking about it, they're probably never going to arrive at the point where they can be much better in that.
And coming back to what we were talking about earlier, it cultivates that infantilizing, dependent relationship upon me.
Stands out.
Rather than allowing them to stumble a bit, have their lapses, learn from their lapses. It's, as I said before, it's about progress, not perfection.
And where does that, like, I guess for all of us, even as practitioners, probably more in the healthcare setting, how much are you willing to do that? And at what point does that almost become, are you liable for the damage that's done? If you run so-called safe-to-fail experiments, and in your mind you have this expectation that they might have a bit of a stumble. With us, it might be someone retweaks an injury, or they have this, and because if you look at it, I'll give you another silly example, but we've got a couple of colleagues and friends that work in elite sport. They're shit scared of doing safe-to-fail experiments. They're so conservative because if there's a little error and that athlete gets injured and they miss game availability, their ass is on the line.
Oh, I see. But so the environment is
constraining that, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know that it's good for that athlete to not be able to take those little, so-called risks, whether it's emotionally, whether it's...
And learn about what actually is
going to lead to a better outcome.
Yeah.
I think more importantly too, in those situations where you try to over-constrain the environment, you may avoid a minor setback, but you actually predispose yourself more to a major setback.
Yeah.
Like they just completely re-rupture their muscle strain or whatever it is. That's the common pattern I think you see, where you think you're doing the right thing of like, everything's under control here, I've got it all sorted. They go back to playing a game or go to do a full training session and they blow out their calf or whatever it is.
And it's because you didn't allow them to kind of navigate and explore some of those things.
So I see this a lot, and a lot of clinicians, and I see a lot of this with psychiatrists as well, where they like to operate like you were mentioning with that surgeon, from a place of absolute knowledge.
Well, it seems more rare now, which is kind of nice. There are a few that still do that. So,
but they'll speak from a place of authority, and they'll diagnose and and this is what's happening, and this is what you need to do. And certain patients will love that. Because they've been told what to do. Dad or mum is telling me what to do, and for some people that to an extent that works maybe is perhaps not the right word, but
it's effective for a period.
It works from a convincing standpoint
to an extent. Whereas to actually speak more conditionally as a clinician, and to not from a place of absolute, more from a place of questioning and wondering and opening up a dialogue and an exploration where you're not this superior person who's got the wisdom to hand down, but a fellow traveller who maybe has a certain few skills that you don't have by virtue of working in this field. I find that, even though what I was saying before about being overly attached to being perceived as this amazing therapist or whatever, there's power that comes from the humility, and it's actually quite liberating to come from that space. We can just be a flawed human being who fucks up and is willing to talk about that in the session, and in association with that attachment process I spoke about before. It's not the rupture that's the issue. It's making sure that you're able to work through the rupture, and so much of therapy is being able to work through a rupture. And both change as a consequence of that, and that reflects a mature process that can be transferred into other relationships as well, as difficult as that is.
It's one of the big flaws, it seems, with human behaviour, because the more convincing you are, the more someone puts faith in your ability. And John and I were talking about this before, of the reality is absolutes are rarely true, particularly in complex systems. And we're talking about researchers within our field, but it applies to any field, of people who, when they talk about their research or the expert topic that they're in, how they actually communicate particular messages. Where there's one person I was thinking of who always uses language of saying things like, actually, we know that this is the case, and actually, and it's just...
And how dependent are they and their careers and their funding on that mindset?
Highly, actually,
and the way in which they're going to distort their data to reflect that.
It's actually
it's
interesting, too. It makes me think of, say, Tanya last week, who...
And not necessarily consciously, but just naturally you're going to...
It's unconscious bias that you have towards perpetuating your own career.
Well, I think it's something like...
if you're totally dependent on an experiment working to be...
Well, I think of someone like Tanya, who's very humble, and I think actually so level-headed with understanding
which will come out with these absolute comments.
Well, interestingly though too, she's someone she's got her eggs in multiple baskets. You know, she's not a full-time, well, she does a lot of research, but she actually does other things like she
That's useful. And all this stuff. That's useful.
So it's just interesting because like you tie it to how strongly is their identity and perhaps their livelihood associated with their being labelled the guru and so on.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure that has a big part in it where they need to maintain a certain...
It's their brand.
A certain brand, yeah. A certain perception.
Okay.
Mm. Yeah. You want to chat about anything else, John? Actually, one thing I think we haven't really talked much about, this question I go back before, is thinking about manifesting some of these behavioural traits in a positive way. Because again, thinking about people from a high performance standpoint, the reality is certain addictive tendencies actually can be very favourable in terms of their willingness to...
Well, this is the question, are they, we spoke about this, are they favourable or are they ultimately destructive, but they can be perceived to be favourable?
Or are they favourable for that particular task, but are they ultimately destructive for the person?
Yes. Yeah, well...
And is that what you tend to find? That
well, what I want, because what I was curious from your perspective, if it's a task that where obsessionality is helpful, let's just say you're trying to be elite in a particular field, presumably you're in the 0.1 percentile of natural ability, and conscientiousness is required to work extremely hard because you're competing against other naturally gifted people who are working extremely hard. There are certain areas where that's of value. Maybe that's not the case with respect to athletes. Where as opposed to say more intellectual pursuits in the athletic realm, that obsessionality could lead to overtraining and a lack of recovery and injury and stress and so on and so forth. So I guess if you can apply that obsessionality or conscientiousness to recognizing that rest and recovery and not having to train like Rocky is actually detrimental to be able to keep, because I think part of the problem is because we're meaning-seeking creatures, we're that's just the way we're designed. Training hard and for really long periods of time, there's instant source of meaning, even if it's not to your benefit in that pursuit. That's where the addictive kind of tendency could take hold. If you don't have other things in your life where it's more balanced, that you're going to be more prone to applying that conscientiousness and obsessiveness to activities where you hurt yourself.
Well, it actually makes you think straight away with athletes that we see where someone presents with an injury, and a lot of the time there may be physical components associated with that injury, like in terms of say a training error or a particular physical deficit they need to develop, but particularly for people who have those addictive tendencies, it's often due to something else missing that's not related to their physical training. So i.e., it could be some basic things like say diet or sleep. But I also think though too, reality is you're not an island. If you say, for instance, don't have good relationships and say social network, I see that as a really negative stressor that has implications for your ability to say enjoy your life, relax, and that's obviously associated with say something like recovery, which is a really important element.
So you think it could actually, a lack of those things, those other areas of life that make someone more complete, if that's lacking, it might actually impact on their ability to recover from just their training and even from injury.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think you sort of highlight this where those traits can be useful clearly for you to pursue excellence in whatever field you do. But it comes at a cost, particularly the more you start drifting towards the only element in your life is your work or your job or your sporting pursuit. And the reality is, if you want to pursue something and become excellent in it, you are going to compromise certain things in your life, and that's okay. But there's obviously again,
a cost for that,
there's a bandwidth too, and obviously that bandwidth will vary from person to person. But it's a pretty lonely, sad life if all you do is, for instance, work. And I think that's actually very relevant for athletes too, where sometimes that might be a hard thing to communicate, but you have to. I know we've talked about this before, John, with some of your athletes, where how good are they at being able to switch off
Yes.
That's probably a big thing, because the reality is, as an athlete, you're not training all the time. There are periods when you're going to have downtime. But what do you actually do with that downtime? And not just in terms of particular behaviours, but even psychologically, what are you thinking? Are you always thinking about the next training session or the competition in 2 weeks, which has some value, but again, if that's all you're thinking about, you're creating quite a large stress response from a chemical or hormonal level, which can start to lead to some of the imbalances associated with
just the cortisone
Absolutely.
elevation is going to make you more prone, more inflamed system. So that comes back to something I wanted to speak about earlier with respect to attachment style. So another classic insecure type or non-secure attachment style is the dismissive avoidant. So the dismissive avoidant attachment style is generally a consequence of an upbringing where the parental figures are not emotionally available, consistently unavailable. So the child in that movement toward the attachment figure when emotionally distressed is just not getting that emotional responsiveness. They may be available physically, they're often available socioeconomically, but they're not available emotionally. So the child in that attachment system, which is biological, the drive to move toward the attachment figure to be emotionally regulated, if that's consistently unavailable, the child has to learn to shut that down. So there's not a movement toward others for emotional comfort. They're usually quite superficial emotionally, not very inclined toward intimacy, not very emotionally open and so forth. But if in combination with that, for whatever reason, they've been either validated or found validity within themselves through things which are more less about connection with others and more about, say, their ability.
Skill or, a trait that they're good at.
Independent things.
You see this so much with people who pursue careers at a very high level, don't you?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about a few people I know and I'm like, actually that makes a lot of sense. Why they work so much.
That's their identity, and it's less about connection with others. Maybe connection with others if they're getting validity for how well they're doing in their achievement.
You tend to find with those people that they're constantly looking for praise about their skill set.
That's right.
That's what they want, and they want you to and they're often telling you about it.
So it can seem a bit narcissistic at times.
I think it is almost narcissistic.
So think about that. Your identity as a person is largely associated with your achievements. You can see how that's going to lend itself to a workaholic type behaviour and obsessionality. It's going to lend itself to that attachment style, not moving toward others in distress, so the relationships become more and more lacking, so your achievements become more and more important. So two things. One, if you're a perfectionist, every mistake is incredibly dangerous. It's like a knife, isn't it? Yeah. Mortally dangerous. So think about the stress of that, having to be perfect. So everything that you're doing is an opportunity to fail. The overall stress of that, the dependence upon that to be okay, and the lack of connection to others, which even though they perceive themselves as not needing others, it's still there under the surface. They still need that, and it's lacking.
Well,
so there's a dissatisfaction that comes with that.
Can I ask you a question on that?
Yeah.
It sounds like, and this is completely with ignorance, but is there a very strong understanding that, and my assumption is that it's true, that human connection is very important for our survival?
Yes.
Right? I don't know this because I haven't read about it, but
it makes sense, doesn't it? We wouldn't have gotten very far without other people.
Totally. Yeah. Everything that you're saying suggests...
Hard to breed.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good thing for some people.
Yeah. I would assume that based on what you're saying, because it's something that we actually don't necessarily ask people, is what are your relationships like?
Well, I thought
because
for instance,
your athletes or your clients,
and I think that the area that you would say this is probably the most likely to affect someone who has, say, like a complex pain presentation or a chronic pain presentation. The psychology of that, I think, is extremely convoluted.
Yes.
Right? And it doesn't happen in this idea of this pathanatomical vacuum.
Particularly as chronic pain also leads to certain psychological, and people tend to get narrow in their psychology after.
And so I'm super interested now that you're talking about this. It's making me think about our practice and reviewing. Okay, are we actually? We ask about things like sleep. We ask about stress. We ask about diet, things like that we know influence some of those psychological factors. They clearly influence the physiology of what their immune response is probably like, and their inflammatory status and things like that. But what you're saying to me makes it sound like it's very, very clear that if you don't have healthy relationships, that there are likely to be other health ramifications.
Yes.
Am I reading that correctly?
Absolutely. But it also, for that, if we're just looking at that person who's of the dismissive avoidance sort of style, that's what's helping them to achieve. But it goes to a certain extent. So they start to get stressed out by that dependence on being perfect. Any mistakes are incredibly dangerous. The lack of connection with others to help them deal with those challenges means that their system is even more stressed. So there's a real vulnerability to moving toward addictive behaviour, substances of addiction to soothe that, because they can't move toward. They're less likely to move toward people for that. But then the substance use starts to impact on their performance.
Yeah, of course. And then
they're freaking out because their performance is
that why
so it gets a vicious cycle ensues, and that's often when people with a dismissive avoidance style come into rehab. And one of the things they'll say, I just need to get a job.
Yeah,
okay. That's all. I don't need to talk about this touchy-feely kind of stuff. That's challenging to work with people in that sort of situation.
And are you encouraging them slowly to open up their opportunities for relationship building?
So this is what we were talking about before with respect to that graduated exposure. So a person with that type of an attachment style who's not inclined to connect to others, who will dismiss emotional openness as weak and all those classic cliches, just to be in a group and to not even engage openly, but to observe others being, particularly to observe others being emotionally open, and to find the world doesn't end when that happens. In fact, they don't get rejected. Others support them and validate them, and it actually results in a greater level of intimacy and potentially even a more effective way to deal with that emotional vulnerability. That's the first point of exposure. They may even resist that and dismiss that and think this is bullshit, and I'm going.
Would you, in that sense, and this is not me trying to find out what to do with the people we deal with, but are you then encouraging them, do you have a friend that you catch up with regularly, right? Because I've got a close mate who he works way too. A few close mates, they work way too much. But he actually loves spending time with his family and doing this, but he doesn't do it enough.
Yeah.
Right, and you can see that it's affecting other areas of his life. He's very successful in what he does, and he's doing very well in his career. But I worry about him as a friend because I see that there's certain things that he's clearly said to me he wants to get out of life, things like a family, that he may miss out on, or at least miss out on in a way that he maybe wanted to experience because he's put so many eggs into this basket. And I feel like for him, one of the key problems is that he doesn't prioritise spending even just time catching up with his mates enough.
Yeah.
Is it something that you would encourage, not obviously in a group setting, because it's not necessarily got to a very pathological level, I would say, for lack of a better term, for his lifestyle, but it could end up there if they don't actually start to open these relationships with people even that they're close with.
So the question is, would I encourage some level of...
Say if someone is dismissive and says, I don't want to come to this group stuff, I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
Just saying okay, can you make it part of it? Again, we'll go to that Peters thing of the little thing you can do. So can you make a phone call once a week to a close friend for 10 minutes? Or have a coffee with them?
Yeah. I haven't... I think about that sort of stuff. I don't tend to move to those sort of plans, maybe a little bit at times, but in that group setting... The first point, for instance, of a graduated exposure would just for them to be talking about what comes up for you in response to when you observe that interaction.
Okay.
what are even the judgments, what are the beliefs that get activated by that? How do you respond to and perceive that interaction?
Actually, in the group setting, is it almost more liberating that they are people you don't really know?
Can be, yeah. So it's a challenging process because it's a very one where we strongly encourage a level of boundaries where they don't develop relationships outside of that group setting, but we're encouraging a level of intimacy for people that notoriously struggle with boundaries. So that's fraught. That's in terms of, what was that term you referred to before in terms of that practice, the safety to fail. Safe to fail. We recognise the risks of people getting into relationships with people that they might go and use an overdose with. Yeah. People are going to call them at 3 a.m. when they've lapsed.
It reminds me of Chris from The Sopranos.
Yeah. There's so
ending
much
up in a relationship with one of the other people in the...
It's a real risk, and we have to keep, as best we can, just encouraging that the group, the therapy is the priority, and any other things are secondary gains, which they need to be brought back to the group. The group has to be the main focus, and if you're perhaps inhibiting what you might say in the group because of these other relationships or cliques that are forming, it's going to interfere with the effectiveness of the group. Yeah. But we recognise that's a natural part of the process, and it never goes to the ideal, far from it.
Yeah. Alrighty, I think we've covered a lot. Is there any final comments?
I remember when you were asking me to come into this to do this sort of thing, and I think we were talking to Lydia, and Lydia says, if it gets to 20 minutes, half an hour, and they say, okay, thanks, we've had enough, Marco, you'll know it's been really boring. So hopefully we got past the 20-minute mark.
We're at 91 minutes, so I'm pretty sure we got past it. This might be our longest. I think this is our longest one ever. So you've done well, Marco.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving up some time.
My pleasure.
All right, thank you.
It's fun.